Hello, everyone. My name is Grandma Michelle Meyer. Pronouns are she, her. If you saw me last year at Virtual Gen Con, you know I really like pop culture adaptations of Jane Austen's work. Last year, I did a video about the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which was a web series adaptation using transmedia elements to tell the story of Lizzie Bennet and her sisters. This year, we're going to the 1990s with Ugh As If, the story of Emma, Clueless, and my other adaptations fall flat. So I'm going to raise this up. Here's our table of contents for today. First, chapter 1 is Emma, so who is Emma Woodhouse? Then we have chapter 2, Clueless, who the heck is Cher? Chapter 3, cultural impact, the lingo, the fashion, and the blueprint to teen movies. And then number 4, other adaptations. So Emma adaptations in the traditional and modern sense. These are my views and my views alone. The best thing about Jane Austen and diving into her work is that all of us have our own views and way of viewing her work. So you might not agree with all I say, or you might see it differently. After all, art is subjective. And spoiler alert for Emma, Clueless, basically every teen show known to man, every movie that came out post Clueless that's teen-oriented, and also the Brat Pack. So, introduction, a little bit about me. So, I'm 30 years old, I'm a Wisconsinite, and I'm a longtime Jane Austen lover, and yes, I have been. I currently live in South Korea, and I'm planning to get an MA Literary Studies, pathway Romantic and Victorian Literature and Culture, fall of 2023. Chapter 1, Emma. Who is Emma? Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and I lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. Emma, Jane Austen. The background of the book is really simple. You're watching this, most likely someone who has already read the book or knows it pretty well. But it was published in December of 1815. It's dedicated to the Prince Regent in a rather tongue-in-cheek way. It's a comedy of manners about social status, marriage, age, and sex, so gender, and features a very large cast of characters. So here are the characters. Emma Woodhouse, the protagonist, who is 20, almost 21, gives her nose into others' lives, but with good intentions. Mr. Knightley, who is a close friend and neighbor, who's 37, and Emma's #1 critic. Frank Churchill, who's 23, the mysterious son of Mr. Weston. The Jane Fairfax, the niece of Miss Bates. We have Harriet Smith, 17, the new girl in town with questionable parentage. We have Robert Martin, age 24, a tenant farmer. We have Philip Elton, 27, the vicar. We have Miss Bates, the aunt of Jane Fairfax. Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father, who is very worrisome. And Mr. and Mrs. Weston, Frank Churchill's father and Emma's former governess. So here's a brief summary. So Emma's former governess gets married, and Emma sees herself as a type of matchmaker. Mr. Knightley tells her to stay out of others' business, but this is Emma Woodhouse. She doesn't take no for an answer. Harriet and Emma meet, and Emma takes her under her wing. And Emma decides that the vicar is better suited for Harriet than Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin and Harriet have already had a type of understanding with each other. Emma gets humbled when she realizes Mr. Elton likes her, not Harriet, and then he goes away for a while. Frank Churchill arrives, and Emma finds him very alluring. Miss Bates's niece, Jane, arrives. Mr. Knightley thinks there is something between Churchill and Jane. Elton returns married to Augusta. Emma speaks her mind and ends up alienating others, getting a reality check in the process. Relationships are revealed left and right. Emma realizes she loves Mr. Knightley. Harriet finds out the truth about her father, and everyone gets a happy ever after. So now we're going on to Clueless, all right? So pretty fast. Now we're going to talk about Clueless, all right? So who the heck is Cher? So here's the history of this. 1995, and was directed and written by Amy Heckerling. It's starring Alicia Silverstone, Paul Rudd, Brittany Murphy, Stacey Dash, Donald Faison, Breckin Meyer with Dan Hedaya, and Wallace Shawn. It's loosely based off of Emma and focused on the impact of giving the new girl a makeover and having your perspective change. And it has created a cult following over the years. Alicia Silverstone is still very active in the industry. She was most recently in The Babysitter's Club. Paul Rudd is now in Emma, and he's also, I'm pretty sure, immortal. Brittany Murphy sadly passed away in the early 2000s. Stacey Dash has had an interesting career with both acting and political commentary. Donald Faison was on Scrubs. That's all you need to know. Breckin Meyer did a lot of 90s and 2000s work, but he was also in Franklin and Bash. And then Wallace Shawn, you all know him from The Princess Bride, but he also was on Gossip Girl, which I'll be talking about Gossip Girl a little bit later. So here are the character comparisons. So Emma and Clueless are very loosely connected. So Cher Horowitz is Emma Woodhouse, Josh is Mr. Knightley, Ty is Harriet Smith, Mel Horowitz is Mr. Woodhouse, Christian is Frank Churchill, Travis is Robert Martin, Elton is Mr. Elton, Amber is Mrs. Elton, Miss Geis is Miss Taylor, and Mr. Hall is Mr. Rustin. So the character of Christian he's more artsy, while Frank Churchill is not. Travis is a stoner, so a stoner type persona. Elton is kind of like a playboy type character. Amber is the mean girl who's a rival to Cher. And then Miss Geis and Mr. Hall are both teachers. So here's a brief summary of the film. Cher and her friend Dion are two girls in Beverly Hills just trying to live their life the best they can in high school. Cher's ex-stepbrother, Josh, arrives in town. Cher gets a bad grade in debate and tries to raise it, but can't. Cher decides that her debate teacher would pair well with Miss. New girl Ty Frazier arrives, and Cher and Dion decide that they should help her out. Insert makeover. The makeover is something that's very popular in 90s movies. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Ty and Travis hit it off, but Cher pulls her to like Elton. After a Valley party, Cher finds out that Elton likes Cher, not Ty. News Christian arrives and Cher takes a liking to him. Marie's boyfriend tells Cher that Christian is gay. Ty's makeover makes her very popular, perhaps more popular than Cher. Ty tells Cher that she likes Josh. Cher feels clueless over everything going on. Cher realizes she's in love with Josh. Cher throws herself into helping out for a drive at school and also help her dad out for a case. Ty and Cher patch things up. Josh and Cher kiss, and the end. So here's where we're going to talk about the cultural impact, the angle, the fashion, the blueprint to teen movies. So a lot of this is going to be my perspective and what I believe. All right. So just go with me for some of this. Some of it you might be like, oh, that's a stretch, but just go with it. Okay. I am going to be talking about the characters a lot during the lingo section. The fashion, I'll be talking about that a little bit, but the blueprint to teen movies as well as television shows, that's going to be interesting for us to talk about. So the lingo, why is the dialogue so popular? So here are some popular quotes. I am totally butt crazy in love with Josh. That's what Cher says. You're a virgin who can't drive. Ty says that. Rollin' with the homies. Ty also says that. I feel like such a bonehead. Cher, and ugh, as if. So here's why the reason this dialogue is so popular. Amy Heckerling sat inside teenagers in Beverly Hills to get a feel of what they said and how they acted. So what they said and how they acted. So she actually sat into the Beverly Hills High School and just watched them, and she noticed that the girls are always doing their hair, being well groomed. And you see that a lot in the movie, especially during the debate scene where Cher actually says the word Haitian wrong, which was Alicia Silverstone actually not knowing how to pronounce the word, and they kept it because it was a really funny bit, because it really helped personify Cher as this type of clueless girl. She was very much like the Valley Girl persona, but she lived in Beverly Hills. Throughout the movie, you find out that Valley is totally different from Beverly Hills, and they actually do go to a Valley party. That Valley party scene actually has become a very popular TikTok sound earlier this spring, where Ty, she gets kind of conked out for a little bit, and Elton asks her what 2 + 2 is, and Cher's like, something that she knows. That was actually used as a TikTok sound. So a lot of the dialogue, even though some of it is actually very dated, if we look at it in a modern perspective, it's very true to the time of the 90s. That was how people were talking back then. However, if we look at everything as politically correct, that would not fly in today. It's a lot of the language is offensive and perhaps even, actually it is ableist, and it also could be slightly homophobic or transphobic or any type of phobic there is. But in the 90s, that was how people talked, because there was none of this back checking with each other like we do now. So the 90s is that very interesting period where things that that are going on in the schools then, they could not fly in schools now. So it's a really interesting time capsule piece right there. Now we have the fashion. So why is the fashion in Clueless so iconic? All right, so here is one still from the movie. I'm only including the one still because there's lots to do with the fashion. But if we look at that, look at this, we see that we have the checkered patterns and it's like very preppy, and they're very like, they're also talking about cell phones, which the cell phone was still fairly new at the time. The characters also still have pagers. So the reason is that Mona May, the costume designer, used outfits that were brighter than the grunge look that was in style during the 1990s. So if you came in the 90s, you know that grunge rock was very popular. Like Nirvana was king, all right? Kurt Cobain's death ricocheted throughout the country, basically. So, and a lot of that came from like the Seattle music scene. So grunge was the look, like that dark, heavy pop, like dark rock type look. That was the style. And then if we just look back again, we have this bright, we have Cher's wearing something bright, and then Dion's wearing something that matches, compares to that, matches with it. So these styles actually have influenced people for Halloween costumes. Donatella Versace actually had an entire fashion spread designed around Clueless. That was as recent as 2018. So the fashion in Clueless is still very much talked about within the fashions. If people look at fashion designing costumes, like, oh, Mona May's Clueless is very good. Mona May's record is actually very, very good. If you look at her credits, you see that she did Romeo and Michelle's high school reunion. She also did the Clueless television show. So she's done a lot of stuff. Her most recent one is actually going to be Ant's third film, which is coming out soon. And now we have teen movies. So we have to do a little history lesson on the teenager. This is something that I have been studying for a while because I find it so fascinating about the history of television and media and culture and how it actually revolves around the teenager. Here's a teenager. There is a childhood to adult pipeline. So basically up until like age 12, you're a kid. And then from 12 until whenever, you're like an adult. Between ages like 12 and 18, that's like when the rich kids would like go to finishing school. They'd have their debut, going out, stuff like that. 1920s, so that's the Roaring Twenties, when the Great War is done. Everyone is just having a good time. The Charleston prohibition's going around, and then it gets, taken away again. So that's like, the good times. But then 1930 happened, which is the Great Depression. 1940s is World War II. But then we have 1950s, which is when the teenager began to emerge. So this is when teens were starting to become a person. They're actually becoming an identity. So you see this very much so with their style. That's when poodle skirts were all the rage, and like they had like, those little bows, everyone was dressed neat. In the 1950s, we also like had the birth of the Rat Pack, which is like, Sinatra and Friends. But in the 1970s, Grease came out. And the movie Grease showed about the 1950s with the teenager. And that's one of the first kind of like times where you see people making like period pieces of something that's more recent. In the 1980s, though, we had the Brat Pack and John Hughes films. So the Brat Pack is an unofficial term, but official term of like members. Like Emilio Estevez was part of it, Molly Ringwald. Just, you can look up the list. And these movies, like The Breakfast Club is one of the most popular movies of teens. It's inspired a lot of like books and TV shows and stuff like that. But I think my personal favorite is St. Elmo's Fire. John Hughes was really like this new blueprint of the teen movie. The teen movie really started with like Grease, but then in the 80s, it became this progression of what a teen movie should be. We also had, around the same time, ending in the 80s though, was the show Happy Days, which was set in 1950s Milwaukee, which ties into the world of Grease. So here we have a television show talking about teenagers from the 50s. It's a time period piece. At the same time, the 80s, we also have that dark classic movie, Heathers, with Christian Slater, which Heathers has actually still had an impact, just like Clueless has today. Heathers has become such a cult classic that it has a musical, which has its own cult following. The musical was off Broadway, and then it's been on West End and touring throughout England. So we have those to think about. But then we have teen television. So teen TV, up until Clueless, was a little bit interesting. I talked about Happy Days already, but we have the TV show Fame, which was based off the movie Fame, which in turn was inspired about the arts high school in New York City, which is still around today. We know it as LaGuardia, basically. We have 21 Jump Street, which was about teenage cops undercover, cops undercover as teenagers. The Beverly Hills 90210, which premiered on Fox. We have My So Life, which had a young Claire Danes and Jared Leto, which only lasted for one season. Part 5 was also on Fox, talking about a series of siblings whose parents die in a car accident, and all 5 of them have to figure out how to survive together. And also we have the TGIF lineup. TGIF was Thank God It's Friday, or Thank Goodness It's Friday lineup on ABC. And that really helped change this type of cultural impact for not only children, but teenagers. So we see by looking at media that a teen was starting to become a primary demographic. They wanted to have teen television, teen movies. Now, Clueless is based off of a book from the 1800s, Emma. And because it was adapted into such a relatable way, other books fell into the hands of directors, and screenwriters were like, oh, this would make a really good story in a modern setting. I can do that. So let's talk about that. So these are some movies that are based on classic books. The Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet came out 1 year after Clueless. This is set, in modern day LA, but they're talking in Shakespearean language. It has some of the most beautiful music and costumes, and it's just so beautiful. She's All That came out in 1999. I'm talking about the original, not the remake that just came out on Netflix recently, which is called He's All That. This has Freddie Prinze Jr. in it, who was one of the hottest stars of the 90s for teen films. And this has the iconic 90s makeover scene because the entire story is based off of Pygmalion. Pygmalion was also adapted as musical My Fair Lady. Then we have what most people will probably think is the best teen movie of all time, 10 Things I Hate About You, which is loosely based on The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare. It has Heath Ledger in one of his first performance, probably his breakout performance, honestly, as Patrick Verona. It has Julia Stiles as Kat, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt's in it. It's so quotable, even though a lot of the dialogue should not even be around, but it's so quotable. Then we have Cruel Intentions. Cruel Intentions had Sarah Michelle Gellar, who we all know as Buffy the Vampire, or you also might know her as Daphne from Scooby-Doo. We have Ryan Phillippe, and then we also have Selma Blair and Reese Witherspoon. And a lot of people know that this is the movie that Reese Witherspoon and Ryan Phillippe met. And Cruel Intentions is based off of the French book So it's very, you can look up what it's about, but it's very, oh my goodness. Then we have O, which is based off of Othello. Julia Stiles is in that. We have Get Over It in 2001 as well. And then we start getting into some movies that a lot of us know. We have She's the Man, which is based off of 12th Night. We have Material Girls, which has the Duff sisters. It's based off of a Jane Austen novel. Easy A, which is Emma Stone, based off of The Scarlet Letter. And then we have Warm Bodies, which came out in 2013, which is loosely based on Romeo and Juliet. So these are just some movies that were based on classic books, which these books would probably have never been adapted if it wasn't for Clueless. But let's look at teen TV shows post-Clueless. Clueless was actually adapted into a television show after the movie. However, most of the cast couldn't come back because of prior commitments. But it did run for a few seasons. We have the show Popular. We have the show Felicity, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Dawson's Creek, One Tree Hill. Those you might know as the WB staples back when there was the B. Buffy the Vampire did end up on you for a little bit, and then eventually and the W folded and they became the CW. We have the original Veronica Mars and the original Gossip Girl. We have Teen Wolf, Riverdale, Elite, Young Royals, Pretty Little Liars, the original, 90210, the reboot that she did, Outer Banks, The Vampire Diaries, the originals, Legacies, All the Arrowverse, the Gossip Girl reboot, and Pretty Little Liars Original Sin, which will be coming out very soon, this month actually, in fact, on HBO Max. Now these shows, a lot of them actually talk about rich kids. Clueless is about rich kids who live in Beverly Hills. So we have a movie that comes about rich kids, and then people realize, oh, we want to talk about the rich kids. But a lot of these stories talk about the difference between rich kids and the poor kids, or sometimes the normal kids and the supernatural kids, like the case of Teen Wolf, which was actually adapted off of a 1980s movie that starred Michael J. Fox. Riverdale is based off the Archie comics. Elite is on Netflix, as well as Young Royals. The CW rebooted 902 for a modern day audience, even using some of the original cast members. So looking at these TV shows, we can tell that creators were thinking about the popular kids because they saw that there was this demographic that just flocked to them because we want to know how the rich people live. For the reason, Clueless is the blueprint to the teen dramas that we have been watching for the past 20 years. The impact has been seen in so many movies and TV shows. All right, so let's go on to other adaptations. So we have Emma adaptations in traditional sense and modern sense. So the traditional is more like the book itself, and the modern are adaptations of it into a modern day settings, so 21st century setting. So 1985, Clueless comes out. In 1996, we have two Emma adaptations. We have the film version starring Gwyneth Paltrow from Miramax, and then we have the ITV version of Emma. Now, the ITV version is interesting because right before that, like a year or two before that, was Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth, which created Colin. So ITV kind of wanted to capitalize on that. Of course, ITV has had a history of having dud dramas, like they do well, but they don't do as well as BBC dramas, and that was their story until Downton Abbey came out. In 2009, the BBC released another version of Emma, this time with Romola. In 2010, there was an Indian film version called Aisha, I think I pronounced that right. So that's a modern day setting about Emma. In 2013, Emma came out, which a web series, and that was from Pemberley Digital. It was told in the same style of transmedia as the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, and they even did a lot of Easter eggs between the two series. However, with that one, it worked more if you were able to watch the stuff happen in real time. There's also the Emma Agenda, which is a web series that came on train, and this time it actually has a female Mr. Knightley. So Mr. Knightley becomes a female, so it becomes Miss Knightley. So it's the first ever time where we have a lesbian version of Emma. And then 2020, we have the focused version of Emma. Now, this one has actually polarized a lot of fans because it's kind of all over the place. I do personally enjoy it. I think the costumes are fantastic, as well as the acting, the script, and the costumes are just immaculate, in my opinion. But the casting, a lot of the cast, they all have Netflix credits. We have Anya Taylor-Joy, who was in The Queen's Gambit, which is one of the best minis I've ever seen. But then we also have actors who play characters on Sex Education and The Crown, which are two very big Netflix shows. So this is more like a Netflix adaptation, even though it was a feature film adaptation. However, with this movie, it came out right when the pandemic was starting for COVID-19. So not a lot of people saw it in theaters. Most people saw it on streaming sites. So, in conclusion, regardless of your feelings about Emma or any of the adaptations, Clueless is a blueprint in not only film and television production, but it also influenced people on how they spoke and how they dressed. 20 plus years later, and Clueless still is a film that many consider to be one of the best teen films of all time, one of the best Austen adaptations. So there were a lot of Emma adaptations that came out prior to Clueless, and these are much older adaptations from the BBC. But the Emma adaptations I was looking at more came post-Clueless. And especially with 1996, seeing that there's two dueling Emmas, it's really interesting to see how Clueless, which is 22 years old by now, is just still very much a well-respected adaptation. So thank you for watching. You can reach me at Twitter at Margot, that's MARGOROTHS. And then here is the presentation template that I use. Here are the credits for that. If you have any comments or questions about things, you can always message me on Twitter, or you can message me down here below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of Virtual Jane. There's so many good panels coming and videos out this year. It's like incredible. And hopefully I'll see you next year, where I'll probably find myself doing another modern day Jane Austen adaptation of some sort. All right. Thank you all so very much.